Hello, and welcome to the Brooklyn Rail's 101st New Social Environment. I'm Sophia Pedlow, and I'll be your MC today for a conversation between writers and art critics, Amanda Fortini, Mary Abbe Hintz, Steph Rodney, who will discuss art criticism in the context of our new social reality with Rail guest critic, David Carrier. We will conclude with a poetry reading from Brandon Downing. We'd also like to thank Dermot Company for supporting this week of the New Social Environment. You can learn more about them and the Rail's curatorial project from 2016 through the links in the chat. And now to introduce our speakers and host today. David Carrier is an editor-at-large for the Brooklyn Rail and will be moderating today's discussion. Mary Abbe Hintz was for 32 years the visual art critic and reporter at the Minneapolis Star Tribune. Amanda Fortini writes about art, design, architecture, fashion, and aesthetics for the New York Times, Style magazine, New York Times, New York Magazine, and many other publications. And Steph Rodney is the senior editor at Hyperallergic and the kind of writer who wants to be read to loved ones at bedtime. Without further ado, David will open up our conversation and then we'll continue on to the panel aspect of today. Thank you.
Great. Thank you so much for introducing us. And thanks to everyone at the Rail, to Fong, to Nick, to Charlie, and to many other technical people who are making all of this possible. And this is my pet here who sits on the computer with me and watches over me. He's stuffed. I want to read a brief statement with a PowerPoint, and then we'll proceed and see how we want to talk. Breakdown of social institutions is traumatic. This happened soon after August 1914, when the Great War destroyed three states, the Austro-Hungarian Empire, the Ottoman Empire, and Russia, and created the preconditions for German and Soviet totalitarianism. It happened in communist Europe in 1989, when state socialism unexpectedly disappeared. And now the social conditions of our art world life have been destroyed. How can we understand our situation? I offered the sketch of a thought experiment meant to inspire interactive discussion. We could see the first of the slides on the PowerPoint, please. First one, and then the next, please, thanks. We've come to Paris to see Mona Lisa. We get to the Louvre bright and early, so there's no one in front of us. Then the crowds come, next slide, please, and she's harder to see. Now, add a slight variation. I am very nearsighted, but with strong eyeglasses, I can see her. She looks great. Third case, I get there only mid-morning when there are vast crowds. Fortunately, next slide, please, I brought a periscope looking over the people I view her. Fourth case, I entered the museum, next slide, please, it's closed to the public, but thanks to a mirror, I can view the painting from the Grand Gallery out of direct line of sight. Now, in just a minute, we'll see the payoff on this thought experiment. Let's get a little further away. Next slide, please. We sit at a Parisian cafe and I open my smartphone to a webcam in the Louvre showing her. If I can see her using a periscope or in a mirror reflection, does not the phone also permit me to view her? I am no longer in a line of sight, but that was already the case when I used the periscope. The smartphone just adds more technology. Next slide, please. Why go to Paris when my smartphone works just as well in Pittsburgh? There's my study. I can see her from the Parisian cafe, then surely we can see her also from Pittsburgh. Mere distance should not make any difference. After all, you can see the moon from Pittsburgh, though it's much further away than Paris. According to long tradition, the artwork is an artifact displayed in the gallery, with some exceptions. Imagine rather that the visual work of art is that artifact presented on the internet. Today's seen art involves looking at it in the gallery. In the future, perhaps what counts is seeing it online. Now Mona Lisa is in the Louvre. In the future, it could be wherever it's accessed online. just as James Joyce's Ulysses is wherever there's a copy of his text, so that painting would be anywhere where there's a smartphone. This is a slippery slope argument. Going by stages, each seemingly acceptable, we reach a surprising conclusion. Perhaps, however, the conclusion is problematic. Freud, in the book on jokes, tells a joke that's relevant. A rabbi in Krakow cries out that the rabbi in Lumbok has just died. However, when people from Lumbok arrive at Krakow, they reveal that, in fact, the rabbi is still alive. In response, one of the Krakow rabbi's disciples says, "This makes no difference. Whatever you may say, the distant view from Krakow to Lumbok was a magnificent one." End of quote. Philosophers argue, but art tourists want to go to the Louvre. Certainly I did. Maybe the claim that you can see an artwork from a vast distance is a claim only a philosopher would entertain. But right now, when the difficulties of travel and being in crowds focus our attention, it's worth reflecting on. Consider a parallel from the sports world. The baseball season is shortened, players quarantine, they come down with the virus, and there are no spectators. You have to watch remotely. Until now, you went to the stadium to see the game, but perhaps that will change. For some years, the art world has made increasing use of the internet. You get virtual tours, and you see many works better online than in person. About 20 years ago, I reviewed a show in New Zealand for Artforum that was divided between that country and Holland. Since most people couldn't get to both sites, there was a CD-ROM that allowed you to imagine turning in either gallery, left or right, going ahead, looking at the works in both hemispheres. That system is sure to be redeployed. If the technology gets better and travel remains difficult, would people be willing to believe or agree that seeing an artwork online counts as viewing that artifact? Would you still visit galleries if you could save time and money by safely getting the tour online? Would you go to the museum if you could better look in your computer? If you could look online at the Met, the National Gallery, London, and the Hermitage, why travel to Manhattan, London, and St. Petersburg? Now, the problems this would create for museums are self-evident. Well, some news sites now charge for access on internet. Museums might adopt a similar policy. How much would you pay to access MoMA, the Whitney, or the New Museum online? Now, popular shows are often overcrowded. That problem would disappear. You could have a wide range of art accessible to everyone with an internet connection. Now, some people thought the internet would provide universal democratic access. They were wrong, and so it's important not to be foolishly optimistic. Just as remote schooling only works for people who have good home access, so online museums could not work for everyone. Next slide, please. The best show I've seen online is the Edward Hopper exhibition here mentioned. Look at that site, it's worth revealing because you get a good view of the individual paintings, you get a walk through the empty galleries, and also you get a walk through with visitors as well as talks by the curators. And if I could have the next slide, please. There's an 8-minute video by Swiss rapper Lauren Busser, who argues that Hopper is a painter attuned to the present moment. It's a brilliant performance, and there's a lot of information. And yet, as much as I admired this show, I would happily exchange my looking online for an hour spent in the exhibition. Next slide, please. In the gallery, you choose where to stand and how to move, and viewing is a social experience. And here from Sepp's book, I have the relevant quote. You attend with a friend, you can overhear other people. And obviously all of those connections get lost when you're in the computer. Now, there could be technical improvements. Already at the rail here, after all, you can hear and see other people. Would these make a difference? Well, let's speculate. Maybe smaller institutions would still close, museums would have smaller staffs, fewer lone exhibitions, but perhaps we should change the nature of the institution. What would that involve? Well, lone exhibitions are expensive, labor intensive, and museums require costly buildings, often in high rent districts. And always there are debates about what to show. So if you move to internet shows, the museum could be located anywhere, and the complete collection could be accessible to anyone online. Now, let me offer very briefly a historical perspective on these possible changes. The late 18th century creation of the Public Art Museum caused many people to worry about what I've called museum skepticism. They wondered, when artworks move from churches to museums, will the art survive? An altarpiece becomes an artwork, the same physically unchanged objects described differently. Maybe we're facing an equally dramatic change. Last thought here, creation of the art museum led to modernist art that was destined to be shown in museums. Big change in the way art was made. Well, some years ago, when MoMA constructed its vast white cube atrium, the first time I went in there, I had the most vivid thought. I thought, well, artists are going to have to work on a different scale because look at this space. Maybe that situation will repeat. I mean, artists now would be thinking, well, if we're going to work on the internet, what kind of works can we show best? Maybe they will think about works that are self-consciously playing to that. Now, I think what's happening, as I see online, is that everyone is experimenting with these issues. Question is, are we in for radical change? As the Chuck Berry song says, you never can tell. So, where should we go?
You know, I'm struck by how much the museum situation reminds me, and the crises that, potential crises that you've raised, David, reminds me of the travel industry also, because they're of course linked. And there is an argument that we should not continue traveling.
Right.
Certainly not on cruise ships. I don't think you're going to get a lot of pushback on that.
Yeah.
But when I think of the vulnerability, for example, of Venice,
Right.
and I've been there and literally seen cruise ships
Right.
5 times taller than any of the surrounding buildings, right next to, you know, any of the great monuments there. And there's an argument for not allowing cruise ships to come into Venice. But at the same time, it's very elitist for any of us to say, well, therefore, none of us should travel to Venice.
Sure.
And, you know, and I think you run into some of the same issues here with museums. Yes, it would save money if there weren't travel exhibitions with big traveling exhibitions. You would democratize access if everything were online. But I think things kind of work together, setting aside, you know, the dramatic idea that we don't travel anymore. But I do think that something like the Frick Museum, for example, has found a fabulous way through its travels with a curator every Wednesday evening, and best of all, cocktails with the curator on Friday evening, where you actually have 15-minute segments that give you a whole lot of background about the artworks and their history and their link to the Frick. And while I've been a devoted Frick fan for a long time, I think theirs are much better than the Met's or the Whitney or the locally Walker Art Center or any of those, and they make me want to go to the Frick. So I don't think that there's any conflict between the use of technology and the opportunities it provides and the future of the institution. I think if anything, the future of the institution is secured by the more engaged opportunities that we have through using tech to bring people in. Anybody else
Yeah.
want to weigh in on this hot
Well,
topic?
I do think that you're likely mostly right, Mary. But I want to suggest that the way that these debates get framed around whether or not technology is going to sort of hold hands with us and usher us into a post-pandemic future that still sort of, what's the word, privileges the interaction with the art object, right? Like privileges the moment of epiphany, of intimacy with objects and ideas. The way that that argument tends to break down is, as David alluded to in his opening monologue, that we tend to ask the question, how is this good for museums? Like what's going to happen to museums over this historical art? I think that the other questions that tend to be asked is, or posed, is how does this affect visitors? And therefore we end up having a kind of conversation around democratizing access, who has an internet connection, who doesn't, how can we make that more possible for more people? But I think another way to look at this is to talk about the community, right? Which is kind of what you alluded to, Mary, in talking about the sort of ecological crisis that Venice is encountering now. I think that we tend to look at through the lens of to these issues through the lens of the institution, and we tend to look at it through the individual. But I think we need to talk about the community, how all of these things affect a particular community. And when I say all of these things, I mean all of these sort of overlapping issues. I think that that in order to really get traction with any of these issues, we really have to get specific and talk about what specific community we think will be impacted by either putting the majority of exhibitions online or not. And I do want to just fold in a bit of a personal anecdote of dealing with the Mona Lisa myself. I went to the Louvre back in, wow, it must have been, I want to say like 96, 97, 98. And I had to see the Mona Lisa because I was at the Louvre, and what else, what else does one do with one's time when in Paris at the Louvre? And I queued up for a long time to get to the front of the crowd to see the thing. And here's the thing about seeing the Mona Lisa in that context, is that it's ridiculous. Like all you see really is a sea of people in front of the thing taking pictures. So flashes going off. So you see the Mona Lisa essentially through a haze of light, right? Of intermittent bursts of light and people. And so for me, the experience was not fun at all. It wasn't particularly enlightening. But at the same time, I think if you see the thing by yourself on a computer screen, you precisely miss that key element of seeing it with other human beings, where their actions contextualize the entire experience for you. So even seeing it through that haze of intermittent flashes, it makes the story for me, it makes the experience for me. Seeing it alone on my computer is not something I'm going to tell you about, ever. And it's not something I'm going to share with people in any sort of meaningful way. You're not going to say to your friend, oh, I was home last night and I happened to see Titian's whatever on the Met site. It's not worth sharing in the same way that as is holding someone's hand and taking them to see the thing, to see the actual thing. So two things in essence is what I'm trying to say is, one, I think one of the lenses we have to look at these issues through is how communities are affected. And two, I think there is something about the primacy of being in the presence of an object that there is no current technological, or I should say, appropriate technological substitute for.
I totally agree with that, and I wanted to comment on it. I feel like the key to David's presentation is, his "and yet" statement, like, and yet I would happily trade, you know, my prolonged experience of the Hopper Show website for an hour looking at Hopper's work. And for me, the question is why, you know, and you're really touching on that, Steph. You're getting at that right now. What do we lose, you know, when we see something on our computer? And it is, you articulated quite well, the social dimension. We lose that whole social dimension. You're not going to tell your friends, oh, the experiential dimension. You know, I looked at this on my computer. You know, Guernica was great on my computer. But there's also other things too, you know, a sense of scale. Really, you don't get that at all. How, I read an essay of yours, Steph, where you were talking about, I think it was your post-pandemic manifesto on looking, which is wonderful, and you all should read it. And it was talking about, you have no sense about how your body relates, your selfhood relates to the scale of the work. You know, you have no sense of context, particularly if with a, you know, an installation or a site-specific work, or just with any work in a museum. And then the social dimension, and what else? The way the works are in dialogue with each other. And then there's that thing that's so hard to articulate, but we all know, which is that, you know, that dynamic exchange between a work of art and viewer, that encounter, that energetic exchange, which I'm sure we could all talk about we all have personal anecdotes where we had a kind of transcendent or infuriating or whatever experience, but we had an exchange of energy with a work of art. And I'm a bit of a mystic about it. It doesn't happen online.
Yes, I agree with all of that. And I mean, I must say that, you know, when I tried this around as a sort of trial run to various friends with the slippery slope, I mean, no one said, yeah, this is great, let's all go for this. But I also will say, and I thought about this when I heard the Met director, and then when I heard Thelma Golden and Glenn Lowry, that look at our New York institutions. They were running flat out with 100% in attendance, or maybe 120% some days, right? Now, if they're cutting back to 25 admission percent, what they're talking about, it's self-evident that, I mean, any kind of prediction, we're not going to have the kind of shows that we've had in the past few years, right? Mm-hmm. So the museum, I mean, the best, and we're talking about rich New York museums, they're under incredible pressure. Mm-hmm. I have no idea how that's going to work, and I don't know that they know. But that's going to, you see, it isn't as if we can say, well, but the world could continue, because short of a vaccine, it can't.
Right. So I just want to ask you all, David, Mary, Amanda, whether you've seen the recent AAM report, which we covered in Hyperallergic, but the source was, I think, the AAM, which concluded that about a third of museums and I think cultural institutions will close post-pandemic. So the landscape is going to be different. It's going to be, I mean, I suppose it's safe to say radically different. And most of those, from what I understand, are going to be small regional museums. And so places like the Met, MoMA, the Uffizi, the Louvre, the Pompidou Center, they're going to be likely okay. But the regional museums, which is, and then there's a parallel to higher education, right? Sure. Most people in the U.S. actually get their college degrees from community colleges. Most people in the U.S. probably have their encounters with art through these small regional museums, right? Yeah. So the question, I think, and this is rightly posed, like, what do we do with the hole, the gaping hole that will create in our culture? Right.
And if I could respond just immediately to that, when MoMA just reopened so recently, and I saw that radical rehang, I thought, wow, this is great. I really want to get used to this. I saw it just before Christmas, and then I saw it in January. I thought, because this is radical. I don't know what I think, but they really have rethought the whole collection of modernism. But now, obviously, to get reflected on that is going to be so difficult. So that the historic dialectic here is difficult, isn't it?
So I want to find out from Mary or Amanda, what do you think will happen? I mean, what will rush in to fill the gap?
Well, it's hard to, I mean, it's very hard to predict the future. I mean, obviously there will be a huge effort to try to regain what we have now. You know, there will inevitably be a loss of some sort. And I think, you know, and I think back with some historic perspective on this, that in Minneapolis and St. Paul, where I've worked, you know, dominantly for the past decades, when I first started out here, there was the Minneapolis Institute of Arts, our big equivalent of, you know, the Met or something like that. There was a Contemporary Art Museum, Walker Art Center. There were various smaller institutions around. And over the 30 years that I was writing regularly about visual art in this community, we suddenly have 3 or 4 sculpture gardens. We have regional, you know, galleries in all the surrounding suburbs. There's just been a huge explosion of stuff. It took 30 years for that to happen. So I could imagine that some of that will close, but I also think that there will be churn, and that out of that churn, a new dynamic of some sort will arise. There will be losses. It will be unfortunate, but change happens. And I don't mean to, you know, sound, you know, Trumpian and say, yeah, I know people die. I'm not talking that, but I do think that there will be change, and you know, there's not a whole lot we can do about that except to acknowledge that that's going to happen. But I don't want to see the big institutions collapse, nor do I want to see the little ones go, but that is the reality of things, and it's kind of unfortunate.
I would also like, just to answer your question, Steph, I would like to see some of the bigger institutions, you know, with the knowledge that this is happening to regional museums and smaller galleries and art institutions throughout the country, kind of broaden their efforts at outreach and start to think about who their audience is, who has access to their art. And I don't mean just, you know, obviously to some degree, making, you know, having online tools available. It does increase accessibility, is sort of furthering the democratization of art. But it's true that a lot of people just simply do not have access to even, you know, a laptop or a way to get online. I teach at the University of Nevada, Las Vegas, and the surrounding community, you know, is especially the area around the university, is a very poor community. And I often visit the elementary schools, and this is just a personal anecdote, but I was visiting a 4th grade class of a former student of mine, and the Barrick Museum is the museum at UNLV. And I told these 4th graders that I was in a Title I school, which is one of the, you know, the poorest schools, public schools that we have there. I told them that when they had gone on a field trip, and they wanted to talk all about the art that they had seen, and they knew all about the art museum there. They were just jazzed by it. And Alicia Curlin, who runs that museum, had created a program of outreach to the elementary school kids in the city. But I feel like the larger institutions could do something like this. I mean, kids all over the country take 8th grade trips to Washington, D.C. Why can't they take them to wherever, you know, the Met, MoMA, et cetera? I just would like to see a sort of rethinking of, like, who are we serving? Who is our audience? Broadening of that.
Yeah, I want to comment on that again from a regional point of view, because certainly here in Minnesota, that has been a major drive of all the cultural institutions here. The Minnesota Orchestra, for example, has groups of musicians that are going around, and I'm not making this up, literally playing in people's driveways right now. And these are top musicians that are going out and playing in people's driveways just to be out performing and to do outreach. The Northern Clay Center, for example, used to have a claymobile in the summer that would go around to neighborhoods all over the metro area and bring the opportunity for kids to get in and work on wheels and to work with professional potters right in their neighborhoods. The Minneapolis Institute of Arts has buses that will bring kids in from all over the state to the exhibits there. And that's, you know, as a kid growing up in southern Minnesota, that's where I first went to Walker Art Center and first went to the Institute. So I think that all that's going on, but that doesn't mean that, you know, the Minnetonka Center for the Arts will survive. The, you know, and various regional organizations around here will survive. But I think there's still the stress, the economic and, you know, technical stress that you're talking about.
These questions are all really, discussion all really great, and thank you all. And I have a question that's really plain to all of us. And this is to put it in a personal way from the point of view of we art critics, we writers, because what I've found, following Amanda to give us a personal story for both Hyperallergic and also for the Rail, is that though I've done some reviews of the shows that are just online, I'm beginning to feel that that kind of wears out its welcome, because, you know, yet another review where you say, well, I looked at the website and I saw this, and I don't know, this feels like they're all turning into book reviews, doesn't it? And so one of the questions I think is, you see, and I mean, it's very self-conscious here as we sit with the Rail support, is what can we, the critics, do at this point? What kind of constructive, I mean, to mention one simple thing, and then I'll shut up here. I mean, what I'm finding here rather fun is that this is more complicated than subtitles at the opera, because as I'm watching you, I keep getting distracted because, of course, I'm looking at the chat on the right. And, you know, it's like the complete things that are related, but they're all different. I mean, I wonder what, do any of us, do we have any kind of shared thoughts, wisdom about what it is to be an art writer at this time?
No.
I think I can jump in here and say it's to flounder around a bit and really just be in this, swim in the same water that everybody else is swimming in. And I had a conversation with, I'm part of the Mississippi Museum of Art's National Advisory Council.
Right.
And we had a group meeting, I think it was, I want to say 2 or 3 weeks ago. See, time is weird now too. I'm having really having trouble like pinpointing when things happen, whether it was a month ago or a week ago. Anyway, we had this conversation, and I said, when I asked about how I was feeling, I said, I feel like every day I'm swimming through cotton. I don't really know how to make sense of this time. And here's the thing. It's a very, very human experience to make sense of really complicated historical developments like this pandemic is. It's typical for us to make sense of these things like many years after the fact. This is why historians are utterly important to us, right? Historians put things into perspective, and they allow us to sort of organize our experiences and our intuitive responses into coherent narratives. So of course we're in the middle of it. It's like sort of like trying to be in the middle of a storm and you know, making a cup of tea. Like it's just like it takes a bit of time and space to actually be able to sit down or sit back and gain perspective on what is happening. So we're all sort of in the mix right now. We're all sort of discombobulated and unsure of how to respond. But what I've been lucky in, what I've been privileged to be able to do is go at my work from a variety of angles, right? So I've written about stuff that's appeared online. Not my favorite thing to do, but I've done it. I've actually made appointments to go see shows in person. I just did that, I think it was, last weekend. I went down to Lower East Side, Manhattan, to James Fuentes Gallery to see a show there. And then walked around to the other galleries that happened to be open, Spencer Brownstone, I think, and Rachel Uffner. And I've also managed or been given the opportunity to curate a show online. And that's a different way of like looking at art and talking to artists and interacting with with art making. So I think all of these actually kind of give me different ways to enter the conversation, to be part of the discourse. And I think that's super helpful because, this time just feels like I don't kind of really know what I'm doing.
I love what you say about just going at your work from different angles. I do a lot of reporting for my work. And so a lot of times you're at the whims of other people. You know, I'm writing profiles and they don't want to talk to you, or they're not going to give you enough time. So I've gotten used to like, well, okay, what can I do? What ways can I go at this? Who can I talk to who's going to give me information? I feel like that's been really useful to me in this time when we just have to sort of accept this is the reality and kind of figure out ways around it to the best of our ability.
Yeah, I think it's easy for us in this community online, as this group talking today, to imagine that we have a large audience. As somebody who worked for over 3 decades for a newspaper whose circulation started out, 600,000 a day and then was about, 300,000 by the time I after 30 years. But even so, it's still the biggest deal in the state of Minnesota, so it matters. And it was wonderful to have, that big an audience for over 3 decades, where I basically was writing about art and trying to engage people in art who frankly didn't care about it. So my job was to give them some, tart, engaging information that would make them say, hey, I could go see this. And that was a great privilege. But as those sort of outlets die off, the number of publications that, our daily newspapers that really reach a large audience dies off, our voices have a harder time getting out to a bigger audience. And that's a concern for me. Nothing we can do about it, especially. But that's why I think video things are very helpful. I think any of these things that we're doing are useful. What I've been doing in this pandemic time is staying in touch with artists, particularly here in Minneapolis. There's been a big kerfuffle over all the stuff that grew up after the murder of George Floyd, which, as I'm sure all of you have seen parts of that video, at least online. And there are a good half dozen or more artists that I know who live right in that neighborhood. A couple of them right within a block of where he died. They've been intensely involved in photographing, videographing the protests and the stuff going on around that. One of them has spent 24 hours walking the perimeter of the 3rd precinct, where is the area where George was killed. It's a Powderhorn neighborhood. Going into the neighborhoods where the park board here opened up the parks to campers to come in and live there. Well, that turned out not to be such a good idea, because the homeless people in some cases were absolutely lovely, and the neighbors came in and fed them, and it was kumbaya all over the place. And then the drugs and prostitution and rapes and violence erupted, and so that was a problem. So what I've been doing is kind of staying in touch with these artists. I don't know what I'm going to do with this info, but the artists are also paying attention. And I think that that will be an important part of the historic record. I know the Minnesota Historical Society is with its, now diminished staff, trying to pay attention to this also. So I'm kind of off point on this, but I think that, we as reporters, as artists, as critics, as watchers, can both go to our institutions. I've also been to the Museum of Russian Art here, to the Minnesota to the MIA and to various other institutions in this time. I think we can go to them. But I think we also can be responsive to the artist community, which is basically what Seth was saying when he was going around to the galleries locally to find out what's going on.
To jump in here, I've received a couple notes in the chat, and people would love to hear more about what you're seeing in terms of institutions actually responding to the Black Lives Matter movement, not just in terms of isolated events, but in terms of a restructuring of those institutions. I'd be curious to hear from the panel on that too.
I'm eager to hear from other people on this. I know that, for example, in the at the National Gallery, which now is headed by a woman named Kaywin Feldman, who was for about a decade, 12 years at the Minneapolis, she was the director of the Minneapolis Institute of Arts. And she's an enormously approachable, very personable individual who at the Minneapolis Institute of Arts launched a program on empathy, for example. She brought in exhibitions of Hmong art. We have the largest Hmong community in the country, actually, here in the Twin Cities, and a strong Somali community. So Kaywin was doing that in terms of exhibitions right along. She was also mixing contemporary art into the historic collections, particularly with the assistance of the then curator Liz Armstrong, who has since moved on elsewhere. So she's very responsive to these issues. And now he's at the head of the National Gallery, one of the, kind of stuffiest, most institutional institutions of art in the country in many ways. And I read online, I haven't talked with Kaywin, but I read online that they had a petition from staff saying, hello, all your upper management is basically white curators. And I don't remember the stats, but you can find it, I think, online. And and they do have a large proportion of Black and persons of color on staff, but they tend to be in greeter positions, guard positions, support positions, cleaning positions, that sort of thing. And Kaywin said, yep, I agree with you. It's a problem. We're going to try to deal with this. Now, that's early in the game, and you can't turn around a ship like that overnight because somebody has brought to you a complaint. But if there's anybody who's going to do it, I think, speaking on behalf of Kaywin, I'm not paid to do this, but I really admire her. I think she will do it. I think locally, there is a reckoning about it, but again, it's like our city council. Our city council here in Minneapolis next door is debating now whether to disband the police department. Well, needless to say, that is a controversial issue. So, these things will take time, but I do think people are trying to come to grips with this stuff. I know the Whitney is. I mean, you guys can talk to the Whitney. Adam Weinberg there has been facing, problems for some time, and I think is dancing on that ball of trying to keep the institution running, but also reach out and respond.
Well, I think that the Whitney, I don't know the Whitney that well. I mean, I did last year go to some press event and ended up talking with Adam Weinberg for about 10 minutes or so.
Okay.
But I don't think that one necessarily learns that much from talking with the director of a museum about what the museum's particular ambitions are, or more importantly, who they consider their community to be. I think that's the question. That's the question for the Whitney. Like, who do they consider their community to be? Their primary constituents. And I get the sense from the research that I've done and from the conversations I've had over the years that the Whitney really is a kind of, that they really are concerned with reaching the bourgeois and petit bourgeois of New York City. I mean, that's just the kind of programming they do. That's the kind of exhibitions they put on. That's the kind of sort of way that they face outward. They are a kind of institution that, I mean, look at the Whitney Biennial. It's a smorgasbord of sort of who's who in the art scene. Mm-hmm. And it's never been my favorite. I think that the museums that are really concerned about that sort of positioning themselves in terms of that sort of hierarchy of social status, not my favorite thing. I do think that museums like the Queens Museum are just continuing to do what they've always done, which is to be really connected in intimate and profound and helpful ways to their surrounding community. The Queens Museum deals with a lot of different demographics in Queens. That place being one of the most ethnically diverse places in the country. And they find ways to construct programming, events, artist projects that actually are done in, are taken up in coordination with, in communication with their surrounding community. So I would point to them as a kind of template for what museums need to. If you get someone like, and actually the Met's gotten in on the act. I mean, they recently created a program last year with, I think, Rashida Bombre and Miguel Luciano. That's a program that's particularly geared towards social practice, socially engaged art. So they've done things like, Miguel has gone out into community and created a, last year, I wrote about this, he created a kind of roving photo installation in Manhattan, in the neighborhood where the Young Lords used to be active. There were installations around and signposting, and there were actually guided tours that Miguel took people on. And that way, that kind of project felt really rich and felt really community-centric and generative. I think that museums that do that really partner with their communities going forward are museums that will survive and thrive.
That's such a good comment. It's that they need to partner with the community to thrive and to go forward. I think that's really, from my point of view, that's really the nut of the whole issue here. I'm thinking
I agree is an important part of it. The other thing, and if I go back a little to your comment and contrast the galleries, is the obvious thing about these New York museums is the cost of admission, because you know, they're expensive to visit, and for a family, they're expensive to visit. I mean, I always thought, because I did a recent book on the art gallery, the paradox is that the galleries are free, but they feel much more elitist. People go to museums, but they would hesitate simply to walk into a lot of the galleries, the kind of Upper East Side galleries. So, I mean, these issues about economics, they're really tricky, and I don't know how to do that. I mean, I remember a long time ago, I asked the museum director, I said, well, why don't you offer free admission? And he said, well, look, this was in Omaha. He said, if you give me an endowment that will cover this, I'd love it. So there it was. I didn't have the endowment. These are tricky issues, but the admission prices make New York museums exclusive. No?
Indeed. Indeed, but I want to say something about that. And this is perhaps going to be a bit controversial. I want to say that it doesn't serve our purposes very well to consistently bang that drum of exclusivity versus inclusivity in a very sort of Manichaean way. I want to say that contemplating art is always exclusive. It is. To be on this planet in this moment now, and to have the time and space to contemplate an object that was made just for that. The art objects are made really just to move us emotionally, spiritually, intellectually, right? Like, if you have the ability to do that, you're already part of a kind of planet, a kind of global elite. So I want to sort of turn down the volume on using that word. Being able to write about art is exclusive. Being able to take the time and really come to know someone's work intimately and have it reward you, and being able to convey what that reward is, and being among a community of people who sort of bask in the glow of that object is elitist. That's okay. Right? Reading is elitist. What's important is to say that even while we acknowledge that, is that we're sort of trying to widen avenues into this place, right? Whatever this place of epiphany, of self-awareness, of generous realization of someone else's vision, whatever we want to call this place, we want to widen access to it, but it is exclusive.
Agreed, totally. Agreed.
So the question is, how can we make elitism more acceptable and more democratic and free? But I absolutely agree with you, and I really appreciate the idea that you would acknowledge that this is a wonderful opportunity that some of us have made in our own lives, or that have been given to us to be able to appreciate and understand. And, and I think I think all these things that we've talked about in the ways museums and institutions and galleries reach out to people, help open up that potential for that special moment, if you will, when people say, hey, I care about this. This matters to me. We might do it through writing about it. We might do it as the Claymobile or the school trip. Any of those things help. Or, an online chit chat like this, will make people say, hey, I'd like to go to the Frick. And I can't have cocktails with Xavier Solomon, but I could go and stare at that painting he talked about, And
I frankly think that one of the ways that this might happen, I'm not predicting the future, but I think one of the things that might help us widen access to these venues and these experiences is if we move art criticism and art presentation, or leaven it, I should say, with storytelling. Because I find that over and over again, people are really enraptured. I mean, it is that sort of like prehistoric moment, right? Like of us gathered around the fire.
Right.
The nights around us, it's scary and dark. And someone tells us a story that really carries us through that moment, into the morning, right? Like storytelling from the people, from what I've seen people who do it well. I mean, for example, I was at an opening for the show that opened at the Mississippi Museum of Art last year, Nick Cave's show. And Nick Cave is someone who can just like tell stories, right? And he's compelling, and he makes the moment sort of worthwhile, and it creates an extra, gives the artwork and the art exhibition an extra dimension that I think really does something that I don't think we do often enough.
That's just wonderful. Yes, I mean, I'm sorry to jump very briefly. I think that this, in a sense, is a good advice for all of us as writers, that we're storytellers. And that's the kind of way that we can create an audience. I mean, the best opening I ever went to was one in Italy a long time ago, where basically each of us had to tell a story. And they didn't want to hear gossip. They wanted to hear a story about your life. And I mean, you realize that they're the audience, they're looking at you, and you have to be compelling. You have to hold their attention. And that, in a sense, that's a perfect example of what writing has to do as well.
I was just going to say, I love what you said. I love that approach. And it is a wonderful reminder about art and culture. We are storytellers. The artists have their own story to tell, about creation. And then also, maybe one way of widening access is to remember that viewers and people who encounter art, they have a story too. And sometimes that's an interesting perspective to bring in as well. And widening access can be as simple as soliciting that story from someone. What has your experience of this been? I love that comment, Seth.
Well, perhaps this is a good moment then to bring in some of our audience voices today. We do have 3 or 4 strong questions waiting. So if that sounds good to you, I'll cue our first one in. Catherine, I'm going to prompt you to turn your mic on. You should be able to talk now.
Okay, thank you. It's not really a question as much as a statement. This is a talk about public museums. And I guess with Brooklyn Rail, one should expect that all roads lead to New York, which is often the case of art in America. And I tend to think about art in other places more, and the extent to which Europe is, and in some other countries outside of Europe, are increasingly funding the arts. And there's not the kind of staff layoff. Therefore, there's more online innovative activity going on. and ways that that is being worked with to sort of create new interactions, and, you know, discussions around, you know, not capturing the passive moment, but interacting with the process. And so I think the whole way art is presented may change or risks to change in some places outside of the US, where there isn't the kind of public funding that for public institutions that there is in other places. And may see fewer closures and may see fewer cutbacks and less loss of sales. Also, I think it's difficult to sort of lump together the traditional museum and contemporary art museums, because I think some types of art forms are going to suffer more in terms of installation art and performance. And certainly what's been going on with artists opening studios in China where they have larger spaces and larger museums has added a lot to the art world. And we're going to be perhaps watching a scaling back of that. So I guess I just want to add something to sort of get, I guess, move away from New York a little bit more and think about go back to where we were in the beginning and thinking about public museums more in sort of an international dialogue than the New York scene. Thanks.
Fair point.
That I think is important. I mean, to go back to Seth's story about Mona Lisa, I mean, when you go to the Louvre, okay, there's a Mona Lisa problem, which is getting in that space. But when you wander around the rest of the museum, there's no one there, even in the middle of the summer. I mean, the Poussins, you could shoot a cannon down, you know, no one, anyway. So in a sense, you see, I don't mean to undercut the differences between French financing and American, but part of the problem with museums is that people only want the 5-star attractions. They don't, the 4-star, nothing. Even Venice in this July it's only crowded right in the center in San Marco. You go 3 blocks away and there's no one there. How you deal with this is a general problem. I don't know.
I want to just jump in quickly to comment on, I think we can solve the Mona Lisa problem. And I think the Louvre could solve it also. No one would ever go to any of the other galleries, but all they have to do with Mona is take her in her bulletproof glass and move her to the Rue de Rivoli, open up one of those arcades, stick her in there, and everybody can see her as they come out of the metro. Right. They can walk down the street. They can salute her as they go by, and they've done it. And no tourist has to queue up and go through the pyramid, wander into the, you know, the Danan wing. And then the rest of us can just go and commune with, you know, Marie de Medici in her badly reinstalled galleries, or your Poussins, or go find that absolutely fabulous Durer self-portrait, which is only open like 2 hours a day. But it's, you know, that's, the point is there to sort of separate the populist icons, the things that people feel that genuinely they want to have seen Mona. She's small, much smaller than they expected, and she's not very interesting, but they want to check that off their list, and it's fine. I have no problem with that. I want to go occasionally to a baseball game. I'm not a baseball fan, but I want to go once in a while. And I think a lot of people should have the opportunity to see that. But what's really interesting to me is what Seth was saying about how you get people into smaller regional museums down in Mississippi, for example. And that's where you have a really genuine encounter with something, the way you do in the back galleries of the Louvre or the back galleries of the Met or anything like that. The big deals, they're not very interesting.
Agree, totally agree. I actually think that if we tossed the Mona Lisa in the ocean, we really wouldn't be missing much, but that's just me.
I'm totally with you. It's one of the world's most overrated paintings.
Underwhelming, underwhelming.
Totally. Sell it off to one of those rich Saudis. The Louvre can just, you know, set its price, $1 billion here, $1 billion there, you know, and then it can get on about its real business.
Yeah. Invest in some contemporary artists, for Christ's sake.
Yes. Yes. Actually, the Louvre has been doing that. I mean, they've been reaching out and, you know, mixing stuff in. Not a lot, but it's there now and again. It was the last time I was there. So anyway.
Thank you so much. Next, we have a question from Fong Bui. Fong, I'll prompt you to turn your mic on.
Thank you for a lively, important conversation. I, remember very well your comment about museum being very close to communities and you cited out also Cleveland being more proactive in the cultural life. And that's partly because, someone like Aggie Gunn, the family is so incredibly tied into the Cleveland cultural life. And they very incredibly heightened in their awareness of diversity. And I think that we were thinking about how to mobilize radical philanthropy when you, David, was describing if someone can underwrite some museum, this is, again, go into the whole context of how we can think outside of the box. Actually, I'm reading my friend Jerome Cohn, who is Hannah Arendt executor right now. And the book is all about thinking, of course, based on her famous phrase, thinking without the banister. Can you walk thinking freely without relying on the handrail? And that's how it's always been. Seth, you write for Hyperallergic, for example. So the publisher have started with the rail, for example, in 2004. It had to be located on the rapport of a certain condition of a community trying to think and create things out of the box. Go back to you, Mary, in St. Paul, for example. I'm on the board of this luminous small artist residency. It's called Second Shift Studio Space. And that's created for women of color and gender neutral. And the kind of thing that we need to think more in the community. We have to think out of the box. And lastly, I want to make a comment, which is, I think is important about the narrative in art. In fact, in the first anthology, The Rail Artist Interview that David Zwirner published, in my introduction, I echo what Toni Morrison said. She said, the first sentence of our childhood, that we all remember the phrase, once upon a time. Well, that's to me is very important, regardless of whether the artwork is abstract or. I think there's a way in which we can tell the narrative. So we live in the technological world where young people, particularly, are bombarded with this thing. They spend 4 or 5 hours on this thing. They don't know how to process culture. And our job, in a way, is to somehow slow down time. Encourage them.
And I agree with that. Just one note about Cleveland, because I taught there for a little over a decade, is that the museum was free except for special shows, but it was free because it was a very rich museum. It wasn't an outreach, because I would wander in the museum. I mean, I taught a class on Wednesday evening that was in the museum, and then I would wander, and the museum typically was just deserted. I mean, I got to know the guards fairly well because they were lonely, and we talked. But I mean, it's a museum that was always a famous, maybe it's changed now, a famously patrician and sort of standoffish museum. It's Sherman Lee's museum, I mean, to give a sort of historical reference. I mean, each situation is tricky. I mean, I love that it was free, but that's a factor of the history of the financing.
But, different institutions have responded differently to that. I mean, the Minneapolis Institute of Arts, when I started, writing for the Star Trib back in the, in the mid 80s, was the great gray, lady of culture here. And Walker Art Center then was hot. Over time, the Institute sort of threw off that mantle of respectability. Not that they're not respectable, but it didn't clutch it around itself, its pearls. Instead, it started to have a Sunday thing when they brought in rock groups and jazz groups, and they had a Sunday program for kids, and thousands of children, can't imagine it now in the pandemic, but literally 2,000, 5,000 families would come in, and they could absorb that many people because they got a lot of galleries, you know, and so their attendance boomed and their outreach boomed. And it can happen, but they need to literally think out of the box and say the box is not, you know, the plaque next to the painting that tells you who did it when. It's, you know, it's some interactive thing where, you know, kids can go through and do a treasure hunt on their phones, a treasure hunt on their phones. What a concept, you know. So
agreed totally, yes.
Technology and outreach and music. They run music in the galleries, low level, but why not?
Sure.
You know, so exhibitions with a musical sub-theme, for example. There are all kinds of ways that institutions can break out of their own insularity. Well, and they are it is happening.
Yeah, as you mentioned, Mary, earlier, when you described well-known musician going to people's driveway and perform. I mean, that, you know, that is not that different really when we remember there was things that were called mobile library.
Yes.
So that was during the Great Depression. It might have started out earlier in Maryland, someone named Titcomb, I think, Mary Titcomb, because he was worried library was not reaching all places. So during the Great Depression, the Pack Horse Library Project, part of the WPA, was to deliver books to remote regions in, you know, Appalachian Mountain, rural Kentucky, which is 100,000 of people. Library was tailored 7 days a week. I mean, that was the way in which we can mobilize similarly. Art was to be on truck or van or car. I don't know, that's another thing. But to mention that I think that we need to think out the box, I want to give credit so much to Leon and Dorothy Rabkin. You know, our friend Susan Lawson, who created the Rabkin Prize in Criticism. That's another way of thinking to support people like us, you guys. You know, I mean, we need more of those places, organizations that need to give back, because Leo, I met Leo and Dorothy through Bob Ryman in the, you know, late 90s, and he was an artist, but he appreciated what was written on his work. So because of his friendship with Susan, who is a young art historian, aspiring critic, got to know him well, and that's what he wanted to do. He wanted to, you know, give back, pay homage to the way how works of art is remembered by through the writing, you know? I mean, we tend to forget how important it is, whether elite or not said. That's another subject we can talk about. But when you think about how Piero della Francesca is a good example, you know, or even Vermeer. Let's take Vermeer, who was not known during his lifetime. It's only 200-something years later, through one essay by this French-born, Italian but French-born Diego Martelli, for example, that they got excited. And then he makes sure that all of his impressionist painters, Renoir and Manet and Pissarro and whoever else read it. And then they went to see the real Vermeer at the Louvre. And Vermeer became very incredibly famous. I think that the writing of art is not to be underestimated. You know, this is an example I can think of my head now. But I just believe that we need to think out of the box. This is how we are going through similar experience where art is has healing power. It saved the nation of the nation's soul in the 30s. The Great Depression.
With good government support, by the way, through the Federal Writers Project and through the Works Project, Work Progress programs,
So I want to ask Amanda, because you mentioned earlier that you go into schools in the Las Vegas area, poor schools, Title I schools, and talk to them about visual art. Is there an institution supporting that work? Are you doing that under your own power?
So a little bit of both. There is an institution that I'm part of, which is called the Black Mountain Institute, which is a a literary institute in Las Vegas through UNLV. It had The Believer magazine is part of Black Mountain Institute. And they have done, they're primarily a literary organization, but they bring in fellows from around the country. And they're a pretty good model for outreach, to tell you the truth. They're doing an amazing job. And some of the fellows have been visual artists and writers, you know, both. So, and then they send the fellows who come from all over to interact with people in the community. I came because my husband was a fellow there first, and then I started teaching in the university, and then I became a fellow because I just, this is very odd, but because I was there, I ended up covering the mass shooting, because the New Yorker called me and was like, this just happened. I know, this just happened. Could you do this? When you have David Remnick on the phone at 6 a.m., you're kind of like, okay. And I said, I'm teaching there. And he said, I know, that's why I'm calling you. So I always joke, I write about art and shootings. But anyway, so I started to go through Black Mountain Institute, you know, because that's part of their mandate, is that the fellows have to do a service component. But then I just sort of do it on my own. They have a reading week where they bring writers into the schools. I have former students who teach in the schools. But to sum this up into some kind of coherent point, you know, I think if we're thinking of art as an elitist thing, something that not everybody has access to, it's like, in some sense, you have to start early to sort of habituate people to say, like, I deserve access to this. I deserve time to contemplate these works of art, to either in writing or just standing in a museum and looking at them. And I think, you know, it's kind of like, I wasn't really taken to art museums as a child. I didn't grow up in that kind of environment. We didn't have a lot of money. My mother was working all the time. And, you know, and I lived in Chicago. I lived 30 miles from the Art Institute. Sometimes it's just a matter of the parent isn't doing it. So there has to be some other person who, and it's not necessarily the parent's fault. You know, it's like they have a 2-hour commute each way to work every single day, and they're exhausted or whatever. There's not an older brother or sister to take you. So I think it's like getting young people, you know, feeling comfortable in galleries, feeling comfortable going to a museum. Like, that's part of it. You know, Hollywood's always talking about its diversity problem. And, you know, they have like 2 movies directed by, you know, people of color every year of the top 100 grossing movies. I mean, the numbers are getting a little bit better, but usually one of them every year is Ava DuVernay. Like, they need more, you know, they need people of color directing things. But what they've discovered, because I teach a women in media class, so I've thought about this a lot and read a lot of the reports, is that they can't just go out and be like, okay, we're ready for some Black women directors. They have to start with the pipeline. They have to go into high schools. They have to go into junior highs. They have to form, like Mary's, or it was Fong, I guess, was saying, like, here's a residency where you get time to develop your voice and to think about.
Amanda, that's really wonderful.
So I have a lot of thoughts about this, and I think you just need to
jump in with a response, a very quick one. Really sort of a
reach out to people.
I'm sorry.
Not always the people that you think. I mean, just don't assume people have access, because.
Where are you, Amanda? We seem to have lost Amanda, but I like to continue that a little bit here, because what she say about the Black Mountain Institute, I don't know whether it came from or being inspired by Black Mountain College, which is
I wanted to know that too.
Yeah, it's so interesting, Mary, because when we talk about the 30s, we talk about Black Mountain College, founded by this gentleman named John Andrew Rice, who actually had often audited lectures of John Dewey. Okay, so this is where it gets so interesting. We talk back to the Great Depression, the 30s and whatnot, and the similar situation too with Dr. Alban Barnes for the Barnes Foundation. Very progressive thinking. And one of the great things that we admire so much of Dewey, especially art and experience, is that the refusal to separate from vocational study to academic learning. You know, everything is tied together. That's why children as Amanda pointed out, it had to start from a very young age, and that's what Dewey did for us in 1918 onward, is to introduce art education from a very early age, from pre-K to high school. And I know this is one of the things that I'm very concerned, because there's so many art education or classes been taken away from early education. And I think that we need to go back to that, because in the 30s, even the Great Depression, education was very important, especially art education. Right. And that's why I feel this is something that need to be reintroduced into our educational system too, not just, economic new model for things. It's about progressive thinking, and this is the time we go through. We need to
Well, I mean, to speak directly and immediately to that, if we, since we're all obviously interested in this, if we said, well, we would love to figure out how to do a talk that would be accessible to public school students, and we volunteer, we'll do a 20-minute talk, we'll pick something lively and so forth, how would that get promoted? I mean, do you have any contact? Does the rail have, how would you go to some school system anywhere really and say, look, we'd like to do this child balloon, we're offering this is a gift, if you can use it. Is that a crazy idea, or?
No, I think it's probable, it could happen, but this is another topic. I don't want to.
Yeah, okay.
Sorry, you guys, did it end? I'm sorry, I got kicked off, and then I called. I was like, I don't know if this is over. Are you just? Am I in a Brooklyn?
We're still here. Actually, welcome back.
Oh, sorry.
We caught most of your your very important testimony. So thank you, and thank you for that work that you're doing. We are at the point in our programming where we will transition to our beautiful poetry reading. So I'm going to thank you very much for all of your thoughts on this matter. We obviously have so much more that we could discuss, so perhaps this conversation will be continued at a later date. So I would like to introduce Brandon Downing, our poet. Brandon Downing's collections of poetry include The Shirt Weapon, Dark Brandon, A.T., At Me, and Mellow Actions. His recently completed 16-book cycle based on Euripides' The Bacchae, originally from San Francisco, he now lives in New York and is freaking out like everyone else. Brandon, thank you for making that such a fun bio to read. Welcome. You should have mic access now.
I do. I'd also like to say to today's panelists, beyond the poetry, somebody whose profession is the design and creation of museums and museum exhibitions, to hear today's panelists and hear these voracious minds coming at it from the perspective of the viewer and from the writer and from the witness of the art object is fascinating, because the industry that I'm in and have been for the last 20 years, we've been going absolutely crazy for the last 5 months trying to figure out how we can rearrange and play permutations on the museum environment to make it exist in the COVID era and beyond. And it's fascinating to hear your perspectives on that side. And now I'm churning myself to how we can bring that into the way that I make museums. That being said, we should probably switch briefly over to poetry. I'm talking to you all today from Kinderhook, a little village in Columbia County, New York, which, for the record, is almost directly accessible from Brooklyn by rail. I thought I would start off with that as an announcement. And I'll read 4 short poems to you today as a coda. The first, for the art writers present today, is called Tondo. New York City makes this noise of bullocks, then acts all breathless but sweetly frantic. Please. Everybody is always devastating somebody. The memo to Paris is bring in new players. We'll keep doing what we want on roller coasters of what we mishear, like coruscating, noiseless doors. 2 30-piece chicken tenders, 4 Diet RCs. The enemy squadron had a hold on me. It was sold on me. My ghost never did come back. It was licked. I forgot to close this gap in the watching of her stead. I remember a man named him, and after hand signaling the crop manager, he said, join up. 2 weeks later, I am immunated and not wrong. I can resolve shadows behind the blinds, but that is about it. I'll look up toward Jupiter, and Jupiter isn't hovering or anything. My man gets me down to the plains, now for the long swim out to the red eye. Deep breath. Come on, sky of rosin. I'm ready to win. I have launched. Look on me with your fucking eyes open. This next poem is in 2 parts. It's called Sonnets About the Real Sun. 1. I see people heading into crowds of people. I shake my head at the old megacity, huddling together like that. They're all exposed to the bad news. I want to drive off. They can't discern a single meaningful sound, only the percussive rush of blood. Here's a fact about Pharaoh. He farts, and we have to just sit there. I'm supposed to believe the sun itself has this agonized, squinching little face, that the sun can't ride 30 feet without falling off his incredible pony? Fine, but I can damn well look up and see the real sun. 2, would you buy that? Oh, bother. The book's out, son. I got my check from the college, $5 million. They found me a Pontiac Trace when I complained. I drove out, did my reading in Iowa City in front of angry, determined young women. In my novel, forget it, not here. What someone reads, it might get re-expressed. Other writers want to break my neck. I ought to bake them a tart, but fill it with lead solder. You can put it where the ad says right to put it, right? Soon be humming like some offshore finance hub. I'm sure you, what? It's only the sun. But I'm not walking away until my kid's manning that wheel. This sun is basically my personal ATM. The Bund. Cross my palms with money, or I'll start caring. Destructive hail of metallic balls can't stop me teleportating. Try and see it from the horse's viewpoint, your tired fatigue. Poor things, burning down their warehouses, the fuck. I lit it up like February in Xinjiang, waiting for that stupid sphere to make its way to me, along with 120 grand, which ended up being for my glaucoma. Another New York poem. De Gaulle. The long hollow is filled up with freezing water, November to April. It creates an entire spectra. The conditions out here would put a keyhole in your back. In a skirt, I don't know, my body feels more like itself. I can thrash dance and nothing is going to happen. We ended up spending 2 weeks on Hen's Head. Going outside after her felt like the truth of an adage. I simply loved getting onto the rides. Our ideal fusion device looks like chewed up gum. I did it as a design job, but filially, I bailed. Not even one good meal. No deal. I told her. I started sharing Chad's treasure with my wife. I wasn't woken up once. I didn't have to shower and dress up for a dunce charity banquet. Don't even get my man Tarzan started on this. He'd turn you into a skin bag. You had better run. Thank you.
Thank you so much, Brandon. What a gorgeous reading to end this conversation with. And thank you to everybody who came out today. Please join us tomorrow for a conversation on whether we still need monuments. Curators, writers, and critics Brooke Kamen Rappaport, Lauren Haynes at Lancôme will be in conversation with Rail consulting editor Joaquim Pissarro and Rail board member Helen Lee. You are all welcome to turn your microphones on to say goodbye on your way out. This is what we call the magical chorus. So feel free to do that.
Thank you, everyone. This was
Thank you so
wonderful.
much.
I enjoyed this a lot. I appreciate
you.
every
Thanks,
discussion.
everyone.
I learned a lot. Thank you.
Such a pleasure to meet you.
Nice to meet.
Bye.
Thanks to all the wonderful comments, to the lively chat today.
Thanks everyone for joining.
Thank you, Brandon, for your reading. Thank you so much. Hey, Jason.
Thank you. Thank you.
Yes, keep up the good work, everyone. Please, please continue to write. And super important. And hopefully we'll have the rail in every city.
Aha.
Thank you for organizing, Fong.
Thank you, Fong. Thank you for doing so much.
Part 2 is coming. I think David's going to do a series. So all of our basically, Amanda, the past winner of Rabkin, you know,